Hi, my name is John Seaton, and welcome to The Outlier's Journey, where we explore the human stories of inspiring paths to success. Now, in a typical episode, we would highlight folks in the African American and Caribbean immigrant communities who managed to overcome adversity and somehow achieve success despite the odds. However, the episode today is a little bit different. Today, I'd like to welcome John Corbett to the podcast, who is a white South African who grew up in Durban. Is that correct?
That's right.
Durban?
Yep.
All right. And so what we'll explore on this podcast is his journey from apartheid South Africa and how his global travels and immigration to Australia helped to evolve his worldview and develop sensitivities across different cultures. Now, John Corbett is a workplace and real estate strategist at Cisco and is responsible for developing new physical workplace settings and implementing sustainable digital workplace transformation strategies. I mean, that's a lot of words. That's basically, John, you design workplaces so that people are productive, essentially, right? Leveraging technology.
Yeah, that's right.
This is a job that's more important than ever as we enter this new era of hybrid work, and as organizations are looking for ways to incent people to return to the office. So I think understanding how different cultures react to different workplace settings is key to being successful in this role. And I think in my conversations with John, he's been very intentional in expanding his understanding of different cultures so that in doing this work, he's as effective as possible. So for that reason, in my opinion, John is an outlier. So with that, John, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you, John. Thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
I hope that introduction captures the spirit of why you wanted to be on the podcast. And so let me ask you, why did you want to be on this podcast, John?
Well, I was listening to your previous podcast, John, and I was quite interested and intrigued by the subject matter and the way you approach it. I thought it was particularly interesting. And, there were a couple of perceptions that were shared, I think, with your previous speaker around carrying prejudice into what we do, and it resonated with me because, as you've shared during the introduction, I come from a background of historical significance with respect to cultural diversity or lack of it, and obviously the implications of living in white South Africa. And it really got me thinking. And and as I shared with you at the time, I've traveled a similar journey to. If I, again, listen to your previous speakers, the themes and concepts and perceptions, challenges, it really got me thinking how I've carried those as well. But I thought it'll be interesting to share some of those with you, John, from a different perspective, because being an outlier, as you well know, is much broader than just where you come from. There's a lot of attachments to the story of life. And anyway, there's a bunch of thoughts that went through my head there, and then I thought it'd be interesting to share those thoughts with you.
Yeah, I'm always interested to understand the lens in which people see the world, right? You're a lot of times the subject of your environment, and it's only when you have the opportunity to talk with others outside of your environment or travel the world that that lens or that perspective gets opened up.
Mm-hmm.
And I think your journey, I think we can learn a lot from that. Especially in this climate. I know you're coming from Australia. I'm coming from the U.S. And today there's a lot of division in the U.S. and people can't see past their own community. So hopefully this conversation will provide a pathway of people to expand their horizons.
That's the intent.
At least that's what I hope to get out of it.
Me too. I love it.
All right, fantastic. So let's start, with where you grew up and the time frame in where you grew up. Apartheid didn't end until the early 90s. And, I got to say, John, you look like a certain age similar to myself. So you probably experienced growing up in apartheid South Africa. So what was that like for you?
Well, it was interesting because my childhood was a little bit different to many others, and I'll share why with you shortly. But I live in a small town. I can't remember what the population was, maybe 1.2 million people. It was a surfing type town, and I wasn't raised in Johannesburg or Pretoria where all the noise was in terms of what
Mhm.
apartheid represented and all the media that you saw around that sort of coverage. My mum and my dad were, you know, just average folks. Racism and politics wasn't something that we discussed only because we didn't have any interest in it. We were a pretty average family, John, just getting on with life, I suppose, and living in a small home and, got the beach down the road and bicycles and skateboards and stuff like any other young kid in America. You're very far removed from the noise of life, particularly given, I think, the environment that I was in and also because of my age. It wasn't something that
Mhm.
bothered me and not something we discussed, not intentionally. It's just we just got on with it, I suppose. So my and I think a lot of white South Africans were in that space as well. To be honest, we just really got on with it. And obviously, certain parts of the country were a bit more political than others. But certainly, from my perspective and the way I grew up, I was quite different because we didn't have a lot of that sort of thing going on. And as I may have shared with you before, I don't remember anything. Remember, I was born in 1970, right? So
Yep.
there was a lot going on. I don't remember seeing anything, hearing anything, other than at the time there was terrorist activity. So we had to learn how to, dive under your table, under your desk at school. I remember going into the schools and there would be pictures of all sorts of AK-47s and landmines, the kind of stuff that the ANC at the time were leveraging for their cause. And so, there were those sorts of activities, and there was a town just maybe 50, 30 kilometers away from where we lived called Amanzimtoti that had a shopping center blow up, and a lot of people were killed there. And
Mhm.
so, but again, that was a little bit far removed from my everyday reality. It was stuff you saw, even though it was only a couple of kilometers away when you're a youngster. That's not something that you see. So those were my associations with essentially the cause at the time. There was only one occasion I remember an activity, and that was when I remember as a kid being on the front lawn and a police van pulled up, and there was two black gentlemen walking along the road, and they were. Back then, they would have to carry like a sort of passport to be in the white areas, and
Yeah.
the police were asking them questions. There wasn't any brutality or anything like that. They were just searching them. That's all I remember as a youngster.
Right. So as a youngster, you weren't, I guess, from being from the white perspective in South Africa, and um, certainly different from if you were black in South Africa,
Yeah.
you would feel a lot of discrimination, or the fact that those folks had to show papers when they were in a certain area. As a child, obviously, um, well, let me ask you this question. Was the neighborhood integrated, or were your
No,
schools integrated
none at
at
all.
all? So
None of
that,
that.
right.
So,
So you didn't see, yeah, so you didn't see the view of, or the perspective of, the black South Africans as a white South African. Everything just seemed normal,
yeah.
right?
Yeah, well, to a degree. I remember asking my mum at a young age, why, what's that? And the way it was
Mhm.
explained to me is, well, the black people aren't allowed to vote. And I think if you're talking to a 5-year-old, how else are you going to explain that, right?
Yeah.
And I remember saying, but why? What's wrong? Why can't they? I don't understand. Why can't they vote? I didn't understand the whole context of what everything was going on.
Sure.
And then what was very interesting for me at the age of 8, 9, somewhere around there, my parents got divorced, and I was fortunate enough to be sent to boarding school. And it might sound a bit strange, but it was great. I love my boarding school, and
Mhm.
it was a private school. It was a very small private school, and it was sort of in a farm community in the Natal Midlands. It was about 200 kilometers from Durban inland, very much a farming community. I think about 100 kids in the school, John, very small school. And I was there for about a couple of months, and then then suddenly we had black kids coming to the school, and I remember the
Mhm.
teachers sort of, I vaguely remember them asking the question. I think in the background they had spoken to all the parents to see, would you have any problem with black kids coming to the school? And clearly there wasn't a problem with any of the parents because we had black kids in the school, and so the
Mhm.
headmaster at the time was very liberal, and he was keen on this sort of stuff, and that's where it becomes a bit interesting, John, because as a young white South African, I was one of the few kids that was in a school with black kids. And
Mhm.
and that's what I was sharing with you. That was made it interesting for me. It was just normal. And none of
Yeah.
this And in fact, some of these kids were leaders. So there was one particular kid, he was a leader, man. And when I mean, you could tell the leaders when you're in boarding school, you can pick it up, a vibe, how certain kids connect with other kids. There was this one kid, he was a black kid, and everyone connected with him, and myself included. And we didn't have televisions back in the day. We used to listen to our radios on a Friday evening or Saturday evening on our beds, and everyone would be on this kid's bed listening to the radio together and stuff. So
Mhm.
yeah, it was just weird that I wasn't part of that, and I got to see a completely different side of it. So and that continued all the way up to the age of about 14 when I left boarding
Yeah.
school and returned back to Durban. So it was a very interesting time, and again, it was a non-subject for us, John. Um, yeah, it was unusual.
Yeah. And it sounds like that you didn't really have a quote unquote negative perception of blacks in South Africa. There was like your mother explained to you, okay, they just can't vote, but it's not like your parents said, oh, these people are bad.
Mm-mm.
It's just that you really didn't have an exposure per se. And then when you did, it sounds like your town was rather liberal, um, and supported and integrated school that you had a positive experience. So, um, one could view that as sort of as an outlier, but I don't want to judge every South African, white or black, right? I'm sure I know there was a huge movement around anti-apartheid movement in the white community as well. And we'll get to your feelings when you were in Tampa about not even wanting to mention, right, in the
Mm,
States that you were South African because of the perception that would cause,
mm.
right? So it's interesting that your childhood, to see South Africa through the eyes of a child in a particular city where, well, I don't even know the right words to use. It's almost like through a child's eye was a curiosity of why are they being treated a different way, and having grown up in that and just trying to understand it, right?
Yeah, and the first introduction, I think, just thinking about it, to yeah, they couldn't vote. That was one thing, but that didn't really mean anything to me. The separation, the equality piece. Now, don't get me wrong. I mean, I was familiar with poor and not poor, and there were a lot of black kids that were poor, so I understood that. But
Sure.
poverty is a global thing. It's not a skin color.
Mhm.
Oppression is a different story altogether. I wasn't exposed to oppression, I suppose. However,
Right.
I do recall when we were at boarding school, my mum and them would come up and take us out for the day. They used to call it, and so we got very excited on a Saturday morning. We used to have school on a Saturday morning, which then ended at 10 a.m. And then we used to race out, and parents would arrive to pick us up for the day, and we would go out, and we would go out to restaurants, whatever the case may be, and there was this place in Moy River. Moy River is Afrikaans for beautiful river. It's a little town nearby where we lived, and there was this ranch there called Sierra Ranch. It was made like a hotel type scene, and we took a kid out with us. We used to be able to take kids out with us, and my mate was black, and we went there, and there was a sign that said "Black kids."
Hmm.
Well, there was a sign,
Take your
and
time.
anyway, that was sort of my first. Well, that's when I got exposed to it.
Yeah. Yeah. So that was shocking for you, right? I mean, I
Yeah,
can see the emotion now, John, that, as a small child to see that and to see it so suddenly and starkly, right? It's not like you were eased into that as an infant.
yeah.
Having gone to an integrated school and have attachment, and they, like you said, they were your mates,
Mm.
and then having the shock of seeing that must have been a real emotional time. I mean, I could see it. I can hear it in your voice.
Yeah. It
Wow.
was, and that's when the human side, all of this starts to come into play, and you start to realize that it's much, much bigger. And don't get me wrong, I didn't go on a quest after this when I saw the sign. I mean, it was just like, what? Doesn't make any sense. And so,
Right.
you sort of park that and you move on. Well, my mum was, oh, we'll just go somewhere else, which is what we did, end up having a picnic or something. So anyway, it was just, yeah, odd,
Yeah.
odd, odd.
Yeah. Yeah. Wow. So, it obviously impacted you. So tell me about just, I mean, I guess the experiences you interacted with blacks in school. I'd imagine there wasn't any opportunities to go to someone else's house, between races.
Um,
Is that correct?
well, let me think about that. It's a good point. Well, we used to have an Indian family that were also at the school. And back in the day,
Hmm.
anybody that was other than white was considered, outside of the norm. And we used to have
Right.
live clubs. So we used to at boarding school, we used to share between parents to bring the kids to and from the school because we used to come home every quarter. And we had an Indian kid that used to come with us. So we used to share the rides. And so we got a bit of exposure that way. And, when his parents would come up to the school, we would all get together and have, Indians have got this beautiful way about them with their food and stuff. So we used to,
Yeah.
get together and have lunch with them and stuff. So I was exposed to a bit of that. But a lot of my black mates that I had, they lived in Johannesburg, and I was living in Durban. So there was not a lot of them that lived in Durban. So I didn't exactly go to their houses on weekends, when we were there on holiday, because they all lived in another part of the
Yeah.
country, because it was,
Yeah.
a boarding school type scene. So yeah, I never really, just thinking about that, then I never really got to experience that, John, just thinking about it. No, I mean,
Yeah.
no, I didn't. No.
Wow. Wow.
Going to their homes,
So
no.
how old were you when you left boarding school and came back home?
Yeah, so at the age of end of the age of 13. So I returned to Durban at the age of 14 and started high school. At this point, it was a bit difficult, and this was where the outlier piece really comes into play because um, as I stepped into this boarding school, I don't, for some reason, my boarding school that I was in, that sort of ended in South Africa at the time, you would commence high school at the age of 13. My boarding school ended at the age of 14. It was quite strange. So I started high school 1 year after everyone had started. So I was the outside kid. You know what I mean? So second year of high school for everybody else, first year of high school for me. And I had to start from scratch, really. I didn't have a lot of friends, and had to resettle into this society that I was now reintroduced to. And like I said, I was back in Durban, nothing extraordinary. I knew some people through previous schools that I'd gone to and stuff, but I yeah, I just got on with it, and it was just rugby and football and all the good things that came with being in high school. And as I mentioned at the time, we didn't have any. Again, even in a government school, this was a full on government school. There was no talk about apartheid. There was no talk about separation. None of that stuff. We just got on with it. In fact,
Yeah.
well, they're actually quite good. We learned about the Zulu Wars. We learned about all the history that was associated with, European dominance of Africa and particularly Southern Africa. Very, very balanced, actually. Very balanced. So it was quite, again, wasn't exposed to any of the heavy lifting. Maybe up in Johannesburg, they may have been learned about all the bad stuff, but we didn't get it down where I was, that's for sure. So we went through that journey, and then at the end of high school, it's time for military service, and that's when the
Hmm.
next phase comes in. We were obligated to
Hmm.
military service.
Yeah. So I'd probably say, based on the environment that you grew up in, and there are communities like this in the US too. I call them bubbles, right? They're bubbles in the sense that they're homogenous communities. And given that there weren't a lot of blacks in the communities, there wasn't the conflict for you to see, right? And you were exposed to it a little bit when you went to boarding
Mm.
school, and then shocked when you were confronted with it when you took your mate to, was it a
Yeah,
restaurant?
restaurant too.
Um, a restaurant, and then saw, starkly what that
meant. Yeah,
what
and I think that was by
what it meant.
design. That
Right.
they did it by design.
Yeah.
Exactly right. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. So, so now I'm curious that you're going into the military, and what was that environment like? Was the military integrated or was it
Yes. So here's
segregated?
the weird part, right? I was lucky.
Really?
Yeah. I got called up to the Navy, and well, my first call up was to the Army, but they call you up at the age of 16. So that's when you get your full. I think it was 16. You got your first call up papers. And then it just comes, and then you would just say, no, you're still at school. And because I think back then, John, at the age of 16, you could leave school, go on an apprenticeship or something. So the idea was, well, as soon as you could do that, you had to do your military service. And so, you get it at
Right.
16. I got Army, and I got another Army call up. And then in my final year, I got Navy. I was like, this is cool. Navy's pretty cool. I mean, there's a naval base down the road from where I lived, and it was on the coast, etc., and so forth. And we got shipped off to the Navy. I rock up there, and the instructors. I mean, this is before Mandela was released. I mean, the country was sort of right responding, I suppose, to all the
Mhm.
adjustments in the world, but it hadn't officially been dealt with. And well, it kind of had on paper, but Mandela was still in prison, so in reality, it
Yeah.
wasn't. And yeah, the instructors were like colored and Indians. I was like, again, did not even the skin didn't even come into the equation. Remember, John, you're a youngster, right? 18 years old. 6 months earlier, I was being taught to finish my schoolwork. Excuse me, a month before I was doing exams, and a month later, I'm being told train how to kill people. I mean, I'm exaggerating, but you know what I mean.
Yeah.
I was getting a
Yeah.
rifle.
Military service.
Yeah,
Right.
so I was more caught up in that stuff than on anything else. So racism didn't come into play. And like in the Navy, what do you do there? I mean, you just run around a couple of boats up and down the coastline. You're not going into the townships and getting into battle, with what my mates in the army were doing. So again, I was pretty far
Right.
removed
It
from
was
all
it
that
was a
business.
controlled interaction. Yeah, it was controlled
Yeah, and my
interaction.
mates, they went into the army. They went to the heavy stuff. I mean, they went to the townships and Parabats, and
Yeah.
they told
Yeah.
me heavy stories. At the exact same time that I was going through this in the Navy, they were going through a completely different world, right? And then while I'm
Yeah.
in the Navy doing my basic training, 2 months in, my data gets released. And then they all call us in and tell us this. And so we look around and are like, yeah, right, okay, so does that mean we can go home now? What's the story, right? And we couldn't. We had to go through it. But again, I was a little bit removed. And here's where it gets interesting again. Finish my basic training. We get shipped off the bases for our next couple of months, and I get shipped back to Durban. I think
Mm-hmm.
80% of the people in the Navy in Durban were Indian, and my reporting officer was Indian.
Really? Okay.
Yeah,
And just
don't
to
ask me why, but
clarify, yeah, it's interesting. And just to clarify, for those who might be listening, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, there were basically folks were split into four different categories, right? It was white, black,
yeah,
colored, and Indian. Yeah,
yeah, but
interesting.
basically, yeah. So yeah, and so yeah, so yeah, it was all Indian. So again, went through all of that. Yeah, I
Mm-hmm.
mean, I saw a little bit of the flip side, you know, um, but not, you know, we were freshmen, as you guys called it, right? So you got bullied a little bit, but you could read it any
Yeah,
way you want, but it wasn't in our face. It was just how it was. Just
yeah.
yeah,
So what was the feelings like? So I think Mandela was released in '90, and then elections
91,
happened
I think.
in, yeah,
Was it 90 or
'91.
91? I can't remember
Uh,
now. Yeah.
so he was, well, I was reading apartheid legislation was appealed in June of '91. And then elections were in 1994.
Yeah.
So what was the feeling in the country? Well, my question is, were you still in the country in '94?
Well, it's interesting because I finished school, finished my military service. I only ended up doing 1 year because they cut it down from 2 years to 1 year, and that was pretty cool. So I finished that, and then I shot up to Johannesburg, and I went to go and study and work in the real estate industry up there for a short while. And while I was there, I decided to travel, and I shot off to the
Mhm.
States. And so that's interesting because I'm traveling around the US doing my stuff, just seriously just backpacking and just being a youngster and exploring the world and stuff, and I can tell you stories about that. And then when I returned, it was so funny because I returned and they were talking about elections and stuff, and because I can't remember that, and I've been away, I didn't even know this election stuff, and
Yeah.
I've never had a vote, right? Because I was too young, and now I had to vote, and so yeah, and I was caught up in the lead up to the elections, into the elections with Mandela. I was in America for a large majority of all the stuff that happened
Mhm.
before, so I wasn't exposed to that. But yeah, and then I had to vote, so it was interesting.
So,
But
so I'm going to get back to that. But what inspired you to go to America?
I had a friend over there. I always wanted to travel the world, and a big part of this outlying perspective, John, is when you're living in apartheid South Africa, you don't see other people from other countries. I
Yeah.
met one or two Americans, maybe. I'd never seen anybody from China before. I was isolated, man. And so at that point, I really wanted to get in touch with the world and understand the world and get on with it, I suppose. And I had a mate living over there, and we started, let's have a crack. And then when I was in the US, I was based in Tampa, but I would, travel around and go to the universities because I was at the time, selling prints, and we used to go and sell these, these little pictures of Mustangs and Malcolm X and stuff like this. We used to go and
Yeah.
sell them in the universities, and then I got to Birmingham, Alabama, and spent time there selling pictures to those guys. They loved all the Nelson Mandela stuff and Malcolm X, so we knew how to sell there. Then we went to Tallahassee, and it was more about Mustangs and stuff, little cars and stuff. So yeah, it was just traveling around the country, seeing stuff, and having a bit of fun and making friends along the way. And the story that like you mentioned before, when people they didn't understand the accent when I was over in the US, they would think, "Are you
Mhm.
Australian or are you English?" And they said, "I'm from South Africa," and totally naive, John. Like, I mean, I'm totally naive. I've never traveled the world before, and I would just get lectures, man. Oh my goodness, about everything that. It's like, oh, I don't want to talk about that anymore. So I used to, when they were said to me, "Are you Australian?" I said, "Yeah, I'm Australian," just because I couldn't be bothered, right, going down that story. And there was one occasion, but I met a lot of people that when they heard I was South African, that they made some, you know, less than appropriate comments, but it's fine. But I was in Tallahassee and I was selling these prints, and every now and again, when after I'd sell prints, if I would say, "I'll just take one of these ones," I'd have a couple of on the side and just give them away, just there, whatever. And, I was happy-go-lucky. And there was an African American lady that I struck up a friendship with, and we were just talking and stuff like that. And she'd bought a couple of prints. I said, "No, and then I said, take these ones for your kids. They'll like this sort of stuff." And she was like really nice. And then she said, "Oh, where are you from?" And then in my mind, I'm thinking, what do I say? What do I say? And I'm like, "Oh, bugger it, I'll just tell her." And her eyes just like lit up, like, what? And and it was interesting because her perspective of me was just this, strange. Like, what? You're a white person from South Africa and you give me things for my kids? And I'm like, how does that work? And you start to realize how muddy things are because of perception. And that's when I start to really put a lot of effort into trying to understand, other cultures and trying to really, put myself in the shoes of other worlds to really remove those boundaries that media and perspective and optics have created and start to interpret things for myself. And indirectly, I went on a journey. At that point, I knew nothing about this world, and I had to put the effort into learning because it wouldn't come to me on its own. And following that, returning to South Africa, working for another 10 years in the real estate industry. Again, not really exposed to anything of a racist nature other than, I was doing a lot of property valuation, and I had to go into the townships and value homes. A lot of the homes had been,
Yeah.
people lost their homes because the banks were just handing out money to do the right thing by the black community, and the credit records weren't great. So homes were repossessed, and I had to go then, value them for repossession and stuff. That wasn't great, but it is what it is. And I wasn't too caught up in it. I was just a trainee valuer learning these things. Um, and then also the monetary policies and how we were lending money. I got exposed to that because I moved to the finance industry, and they were putting a lot of effort into it for all the right reasons. But it was interesting, put it that way. And then John, what really started to open my eyes up was when I arrived in Australia, and so you know having to just think about, well, how do I I was the guy that came from nowhere, and when I arrived here, it was just after 9/11. Actually, it was the February of 2002. 9/11 was obviously September of 2001, and the
Yeah.
industry was in a bit of a hole. And I remember people saying to me, "Oh, you'll never get a job in Australia." I remember recruitment agents saying, or what do you call them, consultants, saying to me, "Oh, you'll never get a job here. You don't. You're from Africa. You don't know the first thing about how it works over here." I'm like, "What?" And at the time, I'd specialized in shopping centers. I could measure, I could value. I used to finance shopping centers. It was an area of I was quite good at.
Yeah.
And I remember looking at them and thinking to myself, our shopping centers are twice the size of the ones you've got here in Australia, because that's how they lived in Australia. They didn't have towns. It was all centralized. And I remember saying to this lady, I said, "You do realize that 1 + 1 = 2 everywhere in the world, right? It's no different. You do
Mhm.
realize that." And so,
Yeah.
so for the first time, I was on the outside, and I had the sign that said, "You can't come in." And so I had to go through all of that.
Yeah, that's pretty powerful, right? So as we think about it here in the States, and even within the Black community, we think, someone from Australia, Britain, South Africa, um, do whites discriminate against other
Yeah.
whites? But sometimes it's cultural,
Yeah, and it's
right?
just fear,
Uh,
John, and that's the thing, right? Sometimes
yeah,
it's not black and white, it's just the fear of the
it's
unknown,
not.
and we
Yeah, it's
wrap it
color.
up because we can justify it in certain ways to serve our own cause. But I started to realize there that, I had to stand up and be counted, and I had to leverage my strengths, and I remember coming out of these job interviews and struggling, and then walking down to Sydney Harbour and watch the boats come in to give myself the energy to go back in
Yeah,
and have a go.
yeah,
Hey, I'm
and
not speaking ill of these people. I'm not at all. I mean, we all like this. If anybody foreign walks into your space, John, if it's your office, your home, you give them the what the yeah. It's natural. It's a
sure,
natural thing.
you want to try and you want to try and understand,
Yeah,
right?
but
I think your superpower is you're curious, right?
yeah,
And, by going to the States and wanting to understand and selling Malcolm X pictures, right, in the South as a South African.
I mean, living in my
That
van in Alabama on the side of the road, man. I
it
just,
takes some gumption,
yeah, and I made so many good friends along the way, and like it was just weird, man. The whole black white thing was so foreign to me. Yet here I am, a South African, right? It's just bizarre, absolutely bizarre, right?
right? And I know people listening to this would say, well, how can the black white thing be foreign to a South African? But again, I go back to that bubble, right? You were brought up in a not isolated, what's the word? Protected, right? Protected environment. You weren't exposed to the conflict. And that was the whole, I guess, purpose, right? In a lot of ways, was to isolate certain
Yeah.
communities from others so that you're not exposed to the conflict.
Even the
And
news, they would
so,
keep that stuff off the
yeah,
news so no one knew about it. But
really,
yeah, but to my parents' credit, and it wasn't by design, it was by chance, I was inserted into a school that had black kids.
yeah, yeah,
So that those walls felt those boundaries weren't set for me. Those social boundaries weren't
yeah.
there. So I was lucky enough to be exposed to those sorts of things. And it's only as you got older you start to realize the value of those perceptions. And
Mhm.
that's where, you know, part of the story, John, is when you were talking before about your other podcasts about how you carry prejudice and stuff. And that's real because I carried that. I mean,
Mhm.
I remember when I started working at Cisco, and that was another big deal for me because for the first time I got exposed to cultures in a way I'd never been exposed. Now, I can be living here in Australia. We can have an Asian community. We can have a South African community. We can have a French community here. They are what they are in terms of their cultural backgrounds, but they become distorted is not the right word, but they become Australianized to some degree. So it blends,
Sure.
and it's cool. That's how we operate as humans. When you start to deal, when I was dealing with Cisco, now I was having colleagues actually living in Beijing and working in Beijing. They were real Chinese people. I was dealing with people in Vietnam. I was dealing with people in Singapore. And so I had direct line of access into folks that weren't filtered. They were, I was, so, but here's the weird part, John, where I had a meeting with somebody and this guy was struggling. And this is what I thought. If you see somebody struggling, you reach out and you say, "Hey, how can I help?" Right? And my instinct was, "What's wrong with this guy?"
Mm-hmm.
And I think what I'm very proud of is I realized, well, that's not right. That's not right. So I put a lot of effort into saying, well, I don't know. He knows more than me. He's speaking English, for Christ's sake. He's
Right.
Chinese, and he's speaking. I
Yeah.
can't speak Chinese.
He's got a second
Yeah,
language. Yeah.
who's the idiot? That's what I said to
Right.
myself, and that's
Right.
when I said I had to learn more about this stuff. So I really got my hands dirty, and I rolled up my sleeves, and I took charge, and I got involved with some cultural programs and stuff. And I think a big part of our society is being continuously curious. I'm always continuously curious, right? Because I think we need to pursue knowledge at our own choosing, not be directed by knowledge, really, right? And so I went hard. And you know what, John, I'm sure you've had an occasion where you would look at somebody and think, what's wrong with this dude? Because he's
Oh, sure.
poor or because he's not like you. And you realize that's just how humans operate, right? And if we allow ourselves to be caught up in that, it's gonna wipe us off the planet, right?
Yeah.
So yeah, I think it's
Yeah.
just being
Everyone.
aware
Yeah.
of that, and you can feel it. As soon as I feel it, I know to
Yeah.
turn it off. And I'm not a racist person. I'm just saying I built up, and I continue to build up an awareness of my environment, so I can be in tune and in touch with my environment, not let my environment define who I am, because that can be very dangerous.
Yeah. So everyone prejudges, right?
Yeah.
And it's that I like the two words you strung together: continuous curiosity. It's the continuous curiosity that helps to fight, push down, eliminate that prejudice, because through understanding, right, you have an appreciation for why, right? So you had this interaction with a particular colleague, and you kind of questioned the interaction because you thought, well, maybe in your interpretation of how he was coming across, it didn't necessarily measure up to your expectations. But then you had to ask yourself why. And then as you dig down into cultural nuances, each culture is different, right?
Yeah,
And
but do you know what the terrible part about all of this, John, was to some degree that's based on racism. Because if I step back and go back to South Africa
Mhm.
as a kid, I've just explained I was not exposed to any of this. Any of this.
Right,
Well, let me
right.
tell you something now. It doesn't matter where you are and how you lived and where you came from over there. If a black person did something wrong, you'll say, what an idiot. That's how they do it.
Mm-hmm.
I picked that up unintentionally as a kid.
Yep, yep, yep.
And if you look
Well,
at
that's being subject to your
yeah,
environment,
and if you
right?
look at that, you're not saying, oh, that person's right. He just said, what a moron. But you would say, what a moron to more black people than you would to white people. So you're a racist.
Mm-hmm.
That's the truth. But
Yeah,
it's a subliminal thing. And then so that kind of defines us. And that's why I think we have to be conscious of these things. And, that's what makes you and I very proud of being part of Cisco and our conscious culture is we put effort into being
yeah,
conscious about these things. I do it with my kids now all the time, all the time.
yeah. Awareness is the first step,
Yeah.
right?
And so I have to manage that now. And I think I do a good job of it. Don't get me wrong, but I had to acknowledge that it existed. When you get these people that talk about, doesn't matter where you come from, I'm not a racist, but are you kidding me? How many times have you heard that, John? Yeah. And so,
Right.
and even with this business about the World Cup in Qatar, we could talk about that from every angle we desire. You know what I mean? I'm sure that some of the management and some of the business with FIFA is a bit dodgy at the moment. We see it on the news. Who knows? I'm not involved. But I sometimes believe that some of that is just because, well, it's them, not us. It's our game, not their game. And I'm like, no, it's the world's game. We should be giving it to them. Why should you see where this is going, John? It's just like this. We think we as certain folks we think we own and entitled to stuff when I say stuff, I mean cultural influences. Like football is a cultural influence. That's not owned by anybody. It's owned by everybody, right? And so now we're making a
Yeah.
deal out of something because we assume some own it more than others. It's like weird, right, John? It's like saying some people have a greater right to life than others.
Yeah. Well, in the US, we don't care about it. So
Hey, I'm not a soccer fan myself, don't get me wrong. But it is a world.
we care about the other football.
It does. It is a world game, and that's what catches my attention. And so, as you know, with the work that you and I do here at Cisco, I'm very much involved in that human centricity, what makes humans tick, and
Yeah.
reverse engineering it for the benefit of the individuals to whom we serve. And you know, that comes about as a consequence of being continuously curious and trying to understand why people do the things that they do. And I think I've built up that uh, skill because of, I think, part of my circumstances of the story I've just shared with you today. You know, I think about it a little bit more than I think others do because of our circumstance. Oh, the one thing I must mention to you that I forgot to mention was when I joined Cisco, going through these motions, I wasn't very familiar with cultural diversity in the same shape as many of my colleagues were. And that's what I loved about Cisco, because I'll get on calls and it was just people from all different countries, even in the US, like people on, like, I'd never experienced anything like this in my life before. It was insane. It was great, you know. And
Hmm.
part of me was nervous because I thought, if I do something wrong, and if there's a racial flare up, they're going to point and say, "Oh, John's a South African. He caused it." So I was
Yeah, that
nervous.
South African dude.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah,
So a part of me was defensive. I'm not lying, but the majority of was me about being curious, and I did want to learn because I could see that, you know, different people perceive things in different ways. I think my first exercise, we had an all hands in Bangkok when I just joined Cisco, and there was a gentleman doing some training, and he said in a scene, he says, "Okay, here's the scene. We're going to meet at 10 o'clock in the morning." Right? That's our meeting. They said to the Indian guys, "What does that mean, 10 o'clock in the morning?" It's kind of like, "Oh, within a general proximity." Talk to the Japanese folks. What does 10 o'clock in the morning mean? So, you know, 9:58. And you could see that one thing had various interpretations just by how culture accepted it. And that's what really
right.
opened my eyes up. Think, I need to understand it a little bit more. I need to understand how they read these things. That's how we're going to learn, you know,
Yeah,
how
yeah.
others.
No, and I think that's, yeah, that's very important. As you plan offices or even, within sales, it's important to understand and appreciate the cultures in which you're either designing for or selling to. I always used to tell the story that when I used to travel internationally, before each trip, I would get a book just to understand the culture of the country that I'm going to, whether it was Mexico, Germany,
Yeah.
the Netherlands. It's just the nuances and having appreciation and showing appreciation to the culture, right? One story I always used to tell was one company we were dealing with was a multinational company, and they had set some standards in the U.S. And so when we would travel, we had to sell to each country individually. And the last thing that I would say is that, this is a US standard, you should follow it, because it was all about understanding the local culture, understanding the local needs. And there was an appreciation for that. And I think that's in anything that you do, whether you're designing an office or establishing a relationship, um, from a sales perspective, respecting culture is important.
Yeah, it certainly is, you know. And
Yeah.
we forget that sometimes, especially in, you know, global organizations, we've got standards and stuff that we would need to instill, but there's an edge to that that
Right.
creates the human side of what we do. And you know, you go to a wealthy person in the US, you got a wealthy person in China, you got a wealthy person in Vietnam, or anywhere in United Arab Emirates, and you walk into their bedroom, everyone's bedroom is going to be completely different because they
Yeah.
identify with values completely differently. So our duty is to understand what those values are, so we can make them accessible to them, not define. The principles are defined: watertight home, you know, wind resistant, and the stuff that we take for granted. But there's elements around that it's human, and our job is to defend those, right? Even what we do with offices, you know, it's someone's home, it's someone's it represents their culture. And so, you know, I often find in organizations, even here at Cisco and other places, we become so process orientated that we lose sight of the reality, which is things that glue everything together. You know, you can have several lanes on a freeway, but it's the glue that glues it all together that makes it a highway. You know what I mean? And so we get caught up in our ruts. And so, um, yeah, I have a hard time with this, John, because it's if you know, you work with me and I create a lot of noise because I believe that, you know, it's an 80-20 game. You know, you could define things to 80%, what you think are defined by 100%, but they're only you'd be lucky to capture 80%. But if the 20% fails, it all fails. No one focuses on the 20%. That's the glue that glues it together. You know, so I'm focusing on the 20 because that's the glue that holds it all together. And sometimes we don't like that because it's tough. You know?
So I think we've gotten to the point now where I understand a little bit better John Corbett's journey from South Africa as a child to where you are today and the continuous curiosity that you have. So, how are you instilling that? So, you say you have children.
Yeah.
How are you instilling that in your kids? Because, you had a certain childhood, a certain experience in South Africa. Now you're raising your kids in Australia.
Yeah.
How are things different for them?
Well, it's the first part. I remember when my child was born, I looked at him and thought, he's got a he's clean. He's got a clean bill of health.
Mm-hmm.
I don't want to muck that up with my perspective. So even if I insert prejudices, perspectives, John, we all get frustrated. I've got a motorcycle. You want to see a person get frustrated? Give me a couple of spanners there for a couple of hours. I start getting very frustrated. And I can't undo that bolt, right? And we say things and we do things,
Right.
but I'm making an effort to make sure that if that happens, that they're aware that that's a situation in the moment and that's not natural or that's wrong. Or if we see things on TV, I think my wife and I put a lot of effort into giving our children that sense of awareness so they could decide for themselves, but through the purity of being curious rather than defined by other people's perceptions. We got a big belief on being ethical too, my wife and I. And I remember we said
Yeah.
even when we moved over here, we said, as long as you do the right thing and remain ethical, we'll be fine.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's what this.
Mm-hmm.
Hey, I've got a mate of mine that's Muslim. I don't know nothing about that, and I'm asking questions about that too. And I'm reading stuff, and
Yeah.
I'm not going to wander off into a particular religious direction, not at all. But I sort of, and I don't mean to offend anybody, but I just see so many of these religions as their own languages for each person to talk to God in a different language. Essentially, if you look at the
Oh yeah.
principles, it's all good and
Mhm.
bad, and the righteousness of doing the right thing. And I think we need it. And so I kind of get that, and so I'm a big supporter of that. Hey, my kids go to a Catholic school. Do you know why? I'm not
Why?
religious because I had a view that religion's a big part of our life. Doesn't matter where you live on this planet, religion is a part of our life. And I can't give them that religious perspective because I'm not religious. So if I put them in the school, then they'll learn some religion because I think it's important to understand the
Right.
principles of it. And kudos to the Catholic school system here in Australia because I went to a day at the school and they were learning about, what are churches and Islam and Judaism and stuff. And I was like, what? Catholic school system is teaching
Yeah.
that? That's
They were exposing
fantastic.
them to all. Yeah.
Yeah, so
That's great.
we have to put ourselves in these curious, uncomfortable positions from time to time to grow, substance in life because there's so much synthetic life around us. We get governed by the channels within which we find ourselves. So we have to cross channel. We have to put the effort into it, and it makes us uncomfortable. But you know what? That's just part of life, and we have to take on that challenge. That's what makes us whole. You know?
Wow. So, John, I'd like to thank you for your conversation today. I think it's very insightful, very thought provoking. What I always say, and I've had a lot of conversations with friends of mine about like what resonates with me is what you said about your son, right? He's born with a clean slate. And the way I look at it is that when you're an adult, you see life through a particular lens,
Yeah,
and everybody's lens is different, and it filters what they see based on their experiences. And so the experiences can sometimes skew reality, right? But to me, the cleaner for your lens is that continuous curiosity, right?
yeah,
Where you could take those experiences and then put them in perspective, proper perspective, by increasing your knowledge of different cultures, et cetera. So I think you're a perfect example of someone who's come from an environment, a harsh environment for, from a racial perspective, and taken that experience and transformed it into something positive that enables you to be more effective at the work that you do today, right? Given that you're driving workplace experiences around the globe and understanding human behavior. And so understanding culture is an important part of that. So I thank you for that, John.
Hey, what a pleasure. And don't forget the power of technology, John, because it gives us an opportunity to reach
Yeah.
into other parts of this planet, you know. And like I said, if we didn't have that technology when I joined here at Cisco, but I would never have been offered that opportunity to get that exposure. It's quite powerful, and we need to take advantage of it for what it is, and let's not ruin it. Let's keep it good.
So before we wrap up, talk to me a little bit about how you think the power of technology can help break down these barriers that we're talking about.
Well, as I mentioned to you before, I've got exposure to working with people in other worlds and other parts of this planet that I would never have got from anywhere else if it wasn't for the fact that I had technology. And by the way, you know, I'm a big believer in working in a hybrid setting because, you know, as an immigrant here in this country, not having a grandparent to look after my kids, I was able to raise my kids from home and work there. These are godsends that Cisco offered me, and I didn't have to hand
Yeah.
my children over to somebody. And so this balance of life is liberating. And so for the first time in our lives, we have the opportunity to liberate people with having that purpose of building homes together and working together versus, you know, either or. And now we've got opportunities to insert ourselves into cultures in a very healthy way. Hey, there's always going to be somebody driving slow in the fast lane. There's going to be a nasty out there. It's just part of life. But I think the bulk of us are good for all the right reasons. And we need to take better advantage of that. Yeah. And I've got friends all over the world now as a consequence of this. And I also put a lot of effort into, you know, removing myself from uncomfortable conversations. If I'm on social media and there's a conversation that's less than appropriate, I don't get involved. I remove myself. It's not appropriate
Yeah.
for me. These are the things we as ethical humans need to accept and take on board because the benefit's beautiful.
Yeah. Yeah. I just look at the conversations we've had, right? Leveraging technology. You in Australia, me in New Jersey, we've had numerous
Yeah.
conversations over vast differences, and we've gotten to know each other a whole lot better because of it,
Yeah.
right? And
Without that, it would
now
never
we're
have happened.
leveraging,
Yeah.
right? And now we're leveraging technology to even amplify what we've learned about each other even more through what we're doing here today.
Yeah.
So it's an incredible thing.
Yeah, it is, John.
Yeah,
We're very blessed. That's for sure.
yeah, we are. We are. So with that, John, I'd like to thank you. Any last words before we wrap up?
No, just thanks for the time, and I hope your listeners found that insightful. But you know, we're all in together. That's for sure, and I love it.
All right.
Thank you.
Thanks, John. So for those of you out there, if you like what you heard, please subscribe, leave a review, share this podcast with someone who you might think might benefit from it. Thanks again for listening.